Let's go. Good Friday morning, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Finding God in the Dark. And my name is Don.
My name's Jonathan.
And this week we are talking about the 1973 rock opera film, Jesus Christ Superstar, based on the 1971 play, theater production produced by Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice.
Hmm.
The film is directed by Norman Jewison. It stars primarily a lot of the Broadway cast.
Yeah.
So at the time, mostly unknowns. Um, Ted Neely played Jesus in the film. And the events of the film are mostly Holy Week events. So mostly the things that happened to Jesus between Palm Sunday and Easter.
Yeah.
Um, Where do we want to start with this one? First off, before we even get into that, it's
Yeah.
really interesting. We talked about these films several months ago when we got together for lunch.
Yeah.
And these first three, because I put them in the order that they're in, not really having seen
Yeah.
Last Temptation of Christ, at least. And
Obviously
these
not.
three have been so vastly different in tone,
Hmm.
um, that it's just, I mean, it's almost jarring.
Yeah.
Entertaining. I mean, I personally love this film.
Yes, I do too.
I love Jesus Christ Superstar. I love the music. I found myself sitting there singing the whole thing while I was
Yeah.
watching it again,
Yeah.
which, dogs were howling and, and such, but,
Neighbors are complaining.
neighbors were complaining. But where do we want to start on this as far as theme and theology goes, John?
Well, we talked about it a little bit before we
Hmm.
started, but I really feel like the introduction and probably I don't know if the filmmakers or the musical writers were thinking this deeply. But that's what's fun about watching movies. You can think deeply even if the people weren't thinking.
Right.
But to me, as a pastor, when you're exposed to literary criticism in seminary, when you're exposed to the idea that we all come to text with our own baggage and we need to think about our own baggage because,
Hmm.
or you think about Albert Schweitzer's famous quote that everybody looks down the well at Jesus and what they see is themselves, like when he's talking about the historical Jesus work.
Right.
But the opening does a really powerful image of all of that to me because they're literally unpacking this bus and they're creating the scenes and they're creating their understanding of Jesus and their understanding of everything that was around him. And their time, their place is shaping how they're coming to his story. And we all do that, but I feel like too many Christians don't recognize they do that, right?
Mm.
They don't recognize they're bringing their own stuff, they're bringing their own concerns. And that's not bad. We can't all strip that, none of us can strip that away from ourselves.
Right.
But it's important for us to recognize our biases. It's important for us to recognize the issues that sometimes we push upon the text. And to me, it was a beautiful illustration of that by them creating the scene and the environment and dressing Jesus and dressing Judas and all that stuff. And so to me, it's an interesting way to have kind of a very artistic way of maybe talking to your congregation about that. I don't know if you're going to unpack that for them on Sunday when you preach about it, but yeah,
I think that really touches on something that I stress a lot in my
yeah,
preaching and in my ministry, and that is context, right?
yeah,
Understand the context, because if you don't, then you are absolutely putting yourself, putting all of your biases and all of your preconceived notions onto the text rather
and
than
and
the text
and
talking to you.
And really, usually when we talk about context, we think about the context of the writer's
Right.
context, but it's also important to recognize your own context, right? And so it
Hmm.
goes from two directions. And so it's important when you come to the Bible to understand the writer, to understand what the writer is trying to get at, the audience the writer was obviously writing for, but also to know your context, know the issues you're dealing with, know
Right.
the scars in your own personal life you're bringing to the story.
Yeah.
And so when we say context, we usually mean one direction, but really you need to do both.
Yeah. It's interesting. It reminds me of a quote from an old friend of mine, a former colleague of both of ours, who now he got this from somewhere else. I don't recall. He did at one time say where he got it, but I don't remember. But
Sure.
the line stuck with me. Text without context is pretext.
Mhm. Yeah.
And that's very evident.
Yeah.
Um, I think you're right. That opening scene really kind of sets, okay, this is this is a 1973,
Mhm.
this is our interpretation of it, 1973.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, I was doing a little of the research on the film.
Mhm.
73 was a huge year for religious films. Godspell came out the same year. There were
Oh,
several others that all came out in the same
yeah.
year. So there was obviously a lot of interest in the early 70s in,
Yeah.
it was around the Jesus movement and that sort of stuff. So
Well, even the film last time was what, 77, something like that.
yeah, yeah, Franco Zeffirelli, yeah. Jesus of Nazareth was 77, yeah.
So yeah, I think, but I feel like some of the ways you can see that is, for example, if you read just the gospel text, Peter is by far and away the most mentioned disciple.
Hmm.
And he's used over and over as a foil for Jesus to kind of point
Right.
out who Jesus is, point out who human beings are, all those kind of things are going on, right? In this movie, he barely exists. You wouldn't even really, it'd be hard to pick him out, you know, except
Until Gethsemane.
except yeah, for one
Yeah.
scene. Yeah. And so they have decided to tell the story between Jesus and Judas.
Right.
That's really the centerpiece of that conversation for them. And again, it's them choosing to how they come to the text and the themes that they're interested in.
Yeah.
And it shapes, because they're interested in the relationship between Jesus and Judas, it shapes how they tell the story, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and it's an
Well,
example of how we do that.
Judas almost plays the role of the devil in this. I
Yeah.
mean, even in the opening scenes, he's wearing red. Yeah.
Yes.
Like it's very symbolic in that
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
Um, there was something we talked about, we discussed via
Yeah.
text that
Yeah.
really stuck out to me
Mhm.
was it was right before the Gethsemane scene.
Yeah.
And it seemed like a temple of some sort, but it was all the after Jesus had entered Jerusalem,
Yeah.
and all these people were saying, Jesus, I love you. Didn't you see me wave?
Yeah.
I believe in you and God. Tell me that I'm saved.
It seems to be the triumphal entrance, or
Yeah,
or the triumphal entrance combined with the temple disturbance, kind of shoved
yeah,
together.
it's in there, right?
Yeah.
It's in
Yeah.
there. But the thing to me was it's that almost looked like, well, the words I used in our discussion were kind of low commitment Christians,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Did
Mhm.
you see me wave? I
Yeah.
love you. I waved to you, right?
And save me, right?
And save me. Yeah.
Me. I'm the important one. Save me.
Right, right.
Um, yeah, I do think, and I said this because I do think it's true when we texted, is not only is that a theme of the movie, I would argue that's the theme of the Gospels. Like a theme of the Gospels is people struggling to understand Jesus, and even when they try to understand Jesus, really trying to control who he is and to control
Right,
how they're going to take his message, right?
right.
And what's interesting, I wondered your thoughts on this, but I really feel like this has kind of the theme or the resonance of, I would argue, the Gospel of Mark more than any of the Gospels. Because in the Gospel of Mark, if you've never read the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of
Mhm.
Mark is most likely our earliest gospel
Mhm.
that we have. It's usually dated around 70 because of the destruction of the temple.
Right.
but Jesus is there's kind of more doubt in Mark. Not only Jesus has more doubt in Mark than any other gospels, but also there's this sense of are we sure Jesus is big enough for this? There's more kind of risk involved in Mark than any of the other gospels about maybe Jesus won't solve this problem. Maybe Jesus can't defeat evil and sin and maybe it's too big for him. And I feel like this movie does a really good job of, having us really question who is Jesus? Is he big enough for this moment? Is evil and sin too big for him? You know, is this going to crush him? And that's really, to me, a big theme of Mark in the way it's not in the other Gospels.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I
Mm.
can see that. There's also that sense of, well, I think we might have talked about this before, that the
Yeah.
Gospel of Mark is sort of the gospel of, and then,
And then, and
then,
then,
and then, and
yeah,
this film does move very quickly
yeah.
from like plot point to plot point, to scene. There's not a
But
lot of transition. It just
yeah,
bumps to the next scene.
but to go back to your other point, because I do think it's worthwhile to set with for a while, is I do think there are way too many Christians, and maybe all of us at different points, not
Oh
just
yeah.
this group of people, that kind of treat Jesus as our ATM. Basically, Jesus is our ticket to heaven. Jesus is kind of,
I gotta
yeah,
sit with that terminology
yeah.
for a second.
But basically, Jesus
Okay.
is here to fix my problems and get me into heaven, and that's what Jesus is here for. And again, one of the quotes in here that I threw out to you was, I think Caiaphas, I know, maybe Caiaphas says it, Jesus is dangerous.
Yeah.
And one
It's
of the
it's
things,
Caiaphas and Annas
yeah,
and that
yeah.
whole conversation. Yeah.
And that's very clear in the Gospels and very clear in how the early church understood Jesus. What frustrates me as a pastor, and even in times of my own life, to be honest, is I don't take, and I feel like a lot of the people I serve don't take that idea seriously. Jesus is dangerous. And what does it mean to say Jesus is dangerous? Why did people want to kill him? And what about following Jesus makes us dangerous? And if we aren't being dangerous to the status quo, if we aren't being dangerous to our communities and to our families, to our churches, are we doing something wrong? And I would argue we are.
Right.
And I do think too often we don't recognize that to follow Jesus means to pick up your cross. To follow Jesus means we're called to die and the Spirit is called to live. And we're called to help God bring in the kingdom of God. That's going to aggravate people because, as to steal from the first movie we watched, Last Temptation of Christ, when Pilate has that beautiful scene with Jesus going, I don't care how you want to change things. We don't want things changed. Like, and, yeah,
The terminology that I have heard is countercultural, right?
yeah, yeah,
Jesus is countercultural.
yeah,
So whatever it is that is popular right now in the culture is
yeah,
probably not where Jesus would be,
yeah.
you know? So, take that for what it's worth. I'm not going to apply it to politics. Let people do that on their own. But um, Jesus is countercultural.
Well, I mean, he chose, I like to point this out all the time. He chose a profession that took him always to the margins, dealing with people other people avoided and were essentially oftentimes ostracized or thrown away. And he chose to be a healer and to not only work with them, but I like to talk about it, pivot back to the community and to push the community to welcome them back, to
Mhm.
recognize that they're less than without these people they have pushed to the margins. That is going to take you places that make a lot of people uncomfortable. And it was going to require you, if you do the work Jesus did, to have really difficult conversations with the people in the community about the people that they view as outside the community.
Right.
And that's there's no way around it. That's going to set off alarm bells for people. That's going to put you in difficult conversations, and that's going to make you a lot of times very unpopular. And I don't think most Christians, especially in America, are comfortable with that reality of what it means to follow Jesus.
Can't argue with that. Can't argue with that.
Um, I guess what I would say to you, because we're pastors, what do you think pastors could do better to help people really take seriously and unpack the idea that Jesus is dangerous?
Hmm. Well, I don't know. The first thought I have here goes back to the days when I was doing youth ministry in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and that is asking ourselves and seriously asking ourselves,
Yeah.
what would Jesus do? Right? Remember the kids used to wear those rubber band bracelets, what would Jesus do? Um, Now maybe it's more important not necessarily what would Jesus do, but where would Jesus go?
And who would Jesus be with? Yeah.
And who would Jesus be with? Maybe that's the bigger question because a lot of us feel like we're doing something if we open up our wallet and hand some money over,
Yeah.
when that's not what Jesus did. In fact, the money, if you just go by Mary Magdalene in the film, right, the money is spent inside the circle,
Yeah.
but he goes to a leper colony,
Mhm.
in the film,
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe that's a bigger question. Where would Jesus go? What would Jesus, not what would he do, but where would he go? Who would he go with? Who would he go to?
And
You
maybe the
know,
question to start with is how has following Jesus changed your life?
that's a fair question as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I wish I could give them credit but I can't remember who said it. But someone mentioned that Christianity is primarily about, or Christians are called to, is how the person put it, is to do two things primarily: to serve God and learn to control themselves, or
Hmm.
not to serve God, to serve others and to find ways to control themselves. And Christians get into trouble when we reverse that and we try to serve ourselves and we try to control other
Control
people.
God.
Yeah. And I thought that was really interesting to think about, how are you serving other people and how are you trying to discipline your own life to reduce the amount of harm you cause people, right?
Right.
Um, and that probably is a better focus than what sometimes we end up doing, which is we try to control other people and we try to serve ourselves,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, we've gotten professional at some of those things, haven't we? I can remember, oh gosh, I'm going back to before I was really even like on the ministry track, but just like helping my senior pastor teach a Bible study in my home church, and she wasn't going to be there one Sunday, so she asked me to cover, and we got into this discussion about putting God in a box. And I said, well, I don't feel like I can put God in a box and say, here is everything you need to know about God, because God's going to get out of that box.
Yeah.
And, God is bigger than that box. I can't fit God in that box. So, and there was one gentleman in particular who was just really adamantly challenging me about that. And I thought, how big is your God, dude? You know? I mean, oh yeah, it's that's challenging stuff, right? It's challenging stuff, and it is. You're right. It, it's who we are, or at least who we're called to be
Yeah.
as people of faith, right?
Yeah.
Not just who is Jesus, but who is Jesus to me, and how has that changed me, and how is that transform? Well, faith is transformative.
Yeah.
How is it transforming me?
Yeah. Well,
you know.
or it's the powerful idea. I'm sure you learned this in seminary, and probably maybe it blew your mind like it did me. But to learn that when Jesus talked about eternal life, he did not mean heaven or hell. He meant existing with God in a deep relationship right now.
Right now,
Right now.
yes.
And
You're right. That blew my mind in seminary.
and to reflect on the fact that we're not waiting to be in relationship with Jesus when we die. You know, we
Mhm.
are called to clear out the room so that God can have more and more of a relationship with us here and now.
Yeah, it's not just the way I have phrased it or learned to phrase it is it's not just a then thing.
Yeah.
It's a now and then thing. It's a now and forever thing, but it starts now. It doesn't start after you die. You're looking at it backwards.
Well, and think about all the images in Scripture, that Paul and other folks who like to use: dying to yourself, picking up your cross, right?
Hmm.
Um, like, I don't think we realize that if we're really going to die to ourselves and if we're really going to pick up our cross, of course that's radically going to change how we live. Of course
Yeah.
that's radically going to change our life.
Yeah.
Of course it's going to lead sometimes to suffering and pain, or at least self-denial, right? And
Hmm.
that means I, of course, have to change. But I don't think sometimes we do a good enough job, and I'll put this on pastors, of encouraging people to do what Wesley talked about, taking your spiritual temperature. You know, I sometimes tell people,
Yeah.
don't compare yourself to other people. Ask yourself honestly, am I closer to God this year than I was last year? Have I dealt with sin in my life better this year than I did last year? Because that's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
That's what you're supposed to be about.
That's 100% of Wesley's. Well, and it's an Emmaus thing too. I don't know if you
Yeah,
did Emmaus or not,
yeah,
but it's a
yeah,
it's an Emmaus thing as well. That, continual growth in grace.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, Good stuff. What else we got in this film?
Well, let me pull up here. 'Cause, um, I think one of the things the only thing that really bothers me about this movie is the line from Jesus where he says, "For all you care, this could be my body. For all you care, this could
Oh,
be my
during the
blood."
Last Supper.
Yeah.
First off, the Last Supper was not in the garden.
Yes, it was not in the garden,
Not
and
in the garden.
and Jesus was not going, you may want to imagine this being my body, and you may want to imagine this being my blood. He did not say that. In fact, I didn't realize this till a few years ago, but Aramaic, the language he would have been using, that's the
Hmm.
language he would have talked to them in. That was the common language of Jewish.
Which, when we get to it, the Passion of the Christ is in
Is in.
Aramaic and Hebrew, so it'll be all subtitles.
Aramaic doesn't have is does not exist in Aramaic.
Hmm.
The verb is, or the whatever it's. I'm not good with language, but
Yeah.
anyway, is doesn't exist in Aramaic, so it's actually even more powerful. Jesus holds up bread and says, "My body," and he holds up the cup and says, "My blood." I mean, that's literally in Aramaic what he would have said.
Wow.
So there is nothing about, oh, for what you might think. No, 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 no. And again, to me, it's really powerful to set with people and to really encourage them to reflect on. I know people struggle with it, but to reflect on that God chooses, when we come to the table, God chooses to be with us not only in spirit but physically,
Right.
to be physic to basically allow us to use all of our senses to take in the goodness and grace of God. That to me is overwhelmingly powerful.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Which is why your church does communion every week.
week, yeah.
Eh, that would
Um,
in two churches that would
that would be a
be
lot.
taxing.
Yeah.
That would be
Um,
tough for me.
the other thing I think is always interesting is Simon's verse where he says to Jesus, um, "You can keep the devotion, but please add in a touch of hate for Rome."
Yeah.
And I
Well,
think,
that's, I mean, that harkens back to, Judas being a zealot,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So,
Well, Simon being a zealot, yeah,
it's not
Simon.
right. So, I'm sorry. Yeah.
But I do think if your Christianity is infused with hate, you're not worshiping Jesus.
I hear that.
Yeah,
Well, and I've used this as a discussion point in the past, okay? How many times have we seen um, a certain church
yeah,
from the Midwest
yeah,
who is really just one family? I think
yeah.
you know who I'm talking about.
Yes.
Probably a lot of Christian people
Unfortunately,
know
I'm
who
from
I'm talking
Kansas,
about.
so I'm from Kansas and they're from Kansas, so yeah.
Okay, so you probably have seen them in person,
Yep,
um, who will go to, soldiers' funerals or whatever and protest with signs that say God hates fags.
yep.
In particular, that's one of their well-known signs.
That's one of their, yeah,
Um, and my response is if you use the words God hates and the
yeah,
next word is not sin, you're wrong.
yeah, yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, if well, I would put it more directly. If you use the term God hates and then put a person or a group of people in that, you're wrong and you're distorting the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah, well, okay, I'll take the addition, sure.
Yeah,
Because because all we're ever taught that God hates is sin.
yeah,
God hates sin.
yeah,
Okay? That's it.
yeah,
You can put any group of people there you want. You're wrong.
yeah, absolutely.
Um so
Yeah,
yeah,
and
what
yeah,
was it? There was also for all you care. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane in the lyrics in the song.
yeah,
And by the way, that song, I went down a little rabbit hole with that song, the Gethsemane song, because of the one note where he goes, "What?" I can't,
yeah,
don't ask me to try and hit it, but that Y set note.
yeah.
Um, and he says in that song, I was inspired, but now I'm sad and tired.
Yes, that's a beautiful. Again,
That,
that goes back to that struggle that Mark in his gospel is very comfortable with.
yeah. And,
Um,
and you know what? Maybe a struggle all of us should sit with a little bit, you
yeah.
know?
Well, again, I think one of the things we do wrong is we don't set with Jesus's humanity enough.
Yeah.
And to again, the cross is no question a sacrifice, but all of it is a sacrifice. If you believe Jesus is God, then all of it was a sacrifice. And
Hmm.
so his passion is his very life. And that's something to reflect on, I think, when you think of it, in the season of Lent, it's something to reflect on that it's not just about the cross. Jesus gives up so much
Yeah.
to be and to heal and to forgive us.
All of the little inconveniences that we go through, Jesus never had to, but did,
It did.
right? Even we've talked about, I think we might have mentioned before, first world problems, but even the little inconveniences, of well, there's, my kid's already taken a shower and there's no hot water, kind of thing. Um,
Yep.
so yeah. Other thoughts on this before we wrap this up?
I just think this is a good movie to have some really interesting conversations about how we think about Jesus and if we are allowing Jesus to be who Jesus is, or are we creating our own Jesus? I mean, that's a huge part of this movie.
Yeah, I'm personally, I mean, I just love I love the music in this film. It's
Yeah,
it, I think I mentioned I was just sitting there singing it, the whole time I'm watching it. And I don't know, did you see the when they did a live production of it several years ago?
Yeah,
Um,
I've actually seen it on Broadway or just on.
oh, have you? Wow. Well, they did a live TV production.
Yep,
Who was it that who played Jesus? It's a popular pop star.
can't remember, but yeah,
Uh,
I
anyway,
remember.
I'll remember after we finish recording, of course.
Yeah,
But the fellow that did Judas in that live production, incredible.
yeah.
But Ted Neely, who did Jesus in the movie production, I mean, his emotions were spot on.
Well, and Judas in the movie, I can't remember who does, but he's amazing.
Yeah, he's great as well. And th this is for me, it's just a fun movie to watch. Yes, there's plenty to think more deeply about,
Yeah,
without question.
yeah,
But I think it's just an enjoyable film as well. I
yeah,
think that successfully, Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice and then Norman Jewison have taken the source material, which can be very solemn and can be done very solemnly, like Jesus of Nazareth was last week,
yeah,
and like some of the films coming
yeah,
will do, but they've turned it into something that was enjoyable to watch, and
yeah,
yet still you can take this depth of meaning out of it,
yeah,
um, which I think is great. So,
yeah.
other than that, you want to talk about next week?
Sure.
Next week's film is Last Days in the Desert. And for those of you who get the newsletter from my churches, yes, I realize I spelled it dessert. I'm sorry for that. I have corrected it. It is
No one
Last
said
Days.
that you had grammar working for you.
Look, I know what I want to say. Doesn't mean I know how to spell it.
Yeah, neither of us should edit anyone's paper, so we'll just
No,
go.
exactly true. So next week's film is Last Days in the Desert, which I have not seen. So,
Yeah, I saw it a long time ago. I think it's going to be an interesting conversation.
okay, I know that's on streaming. I'm pretty sure it's on Prime. So if you're looking for it, that's probably where you'll find it. And coming up, not too far off, we'll have The Last Temptation of Christ and Risen. So keep those in your mind.
All right.
Um, any other thoughts on Jesus Christ Superstar?
If you haven't seen it, see it. It's a really good movie.
It's absolutely worth seeing.
Yeah.
And some folks, I think I mentioned last week, some folks were like, "Why not Godspell?" Well,
This is better.
I like this better. So, all right, friends, that's going to be all for this week. Thanks for watching, and keep on finding God in the dark.
See you
Take
later.
care. Friends, thank you again for watching the Finding God in the Dark podcast. If you're finding these discussions helpful or meaningful in your Christian walk, then we'd invite you to go ahead and subscribe down below. Get more of this content. We publish every Friday morning at 10 a.m., and we're so glad that you can be with us and enjoy these discussions as well. Take care and God bless. Bye now.